we'll get going here. So we just wanted to sort of welcome everyone and say that we're quite excited to have this session today on innovation and change processes, social construction and design thinking with Sheila McNamee and Tseliou Camargo-Borges. This is a part of kind of a yearly series we do with the Systems Beings Lab at the University of British Columbia, and I'm one of the co-founders of it. And my name is Derek Gladwin, and I'm in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. And Naoko, you want to?
Sure. My name is Naoko Ellis. I'm as well a co-founder of Systems Beings Lab, and I'm in chemical engineering at UBC.
Yeah, and I guess we just also want to acknowledge that we, Naoko and I, and some of us part of the Systems Beings Lab who are here, we work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples. And so we're privileged and honored to sort of be in lands where relational and systems thinking have been long-standing, and trying to bring more of those kinds of epistemological and ontological approaches in the work that we do. Yeah, and I guess that takes us a little bit about what we do is at the Systems Beings Lab. So Naoko, maybe you want to give us an overview on that.
Sure. A little bit about SBL, as we call it, is a collective research, a collaborative research collective to facilitate and elevate various approaches to grapple with complexity. We acknowledge that the ability of a society to understand and respond to complexity requires knowledge and awareness of systems and our interconnected relations to them. And as learning and adaptive beings of all, we're part of the system, and we shape them as much as they shape us. And flowing from various expertise and experiences in the collective lab that we have, from ecology, education, engineering, poetry, geography, and futurism, we're really fortunate to develop a transdisciplinary spaces to explore complexity from cognitive, relational, and affective perspectives. So we ultimately explore integrated and holistic ways of experiencing, living, sensing, and showing up in the world. It's great to see some of the SBL members here today. Di from Cambridge. I see Michelle and Rachel from the West Coast. And actually, one of our speakers today, Tseliou, is also a member from the Netherlands. Yeah, so I'll pass it back over to you, Derek.
Yeah, and so we're quite privileged to have both Sheila and Tseliou do a webinar here, and this session the aim is to focus on sort of the generative power of co-construction, particularly of whole systems, of appreciation, of creating conditions for people to come together and work collaboratively to affect social change. The aim is really to integrate the theory of social construction with the tools and the principles of design thinking, thereby creating a relational, sensitive, and process-oriented approach to research. And so before we hand it over to them, we'll just first introduce them to the audience. For those of you who don't already know their work, I see some people here are familiar and know their work, but some do not. So Sheila McNamee is a Professor Emerita of Communication at the University of New Hampshire, and the co-founder and vice president of the Taos Institute. Her work is focused on dialogic transformation within various social and institutional contexts, including psychotherapy, education, healthcare, organizations, and communities. She's the author of many books, including, though, most recently, Practicing Therapy of Social Construction, and then also Design Thinking and Social Construction with Tseliou here. And she has authored many books on social change, sustainable dialogue, and relational education. Tseliou Camargo-Borges is a senior lecturer and researcher at Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, and as a faculty and member of the executive board of the Taos Institute as well. Tseliou is a psychologist working with constructionist theory and design thinking approach to create more participatory formats of learning and Innovation in Society. She's the author of several articles and contributor and editor of a variety of handbooks, such as Sage Handbook and of Social Constructionist Practice, the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, and the Handbook for Creative Futures. She is also the founder of Designing Conversations, where she consults in dialogical processes and designing research. And I might just put in the chat the links for the Designing Conversations and also the Taos Institute, which they're both connected to, and which does a lot of programming and educational outreach that folks here might be interested in. So anyway, at that, we're thrilled to have you both here, have everyone here, and we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Yoko. It's nice to be here with everyone. Tseliou, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. Welcome, everyone. I'm very curious to hear a little bit from you. I know we have a limited amount of time, but why don't you guys go ahead and write in the chat where you're talking from and, you know, a little thing about yourself so we can get a bit of a context here. We are very happy to be here with you today, sharing a bit of the ideas we have written in this book. So Derek and Naoko were sharing about the research lab and their work, and this is so much related to our approach to research and intervention. And one very important element here that we bring in the book is how can we move away from this idea in science, in research, that we are objective and neutral researchers trusting fully and completely to our methodology. And instead, we can kind of embrace our biases and then become aware of our positionality and our implication in research, and how can methodology be just a compass to support us, not just producing knowledge, but changing the system. So how can we create conditions as a researchers and not just, you know, be there behind the methodology, believing that everything else will unfold from there. So we wanted to write a book about it, and we are bringing the ideas of social construction together with some principles of design thinking. And we would like to share some slides with you, and we also would like to just present the slides in a conversational mode and stop here and there to ask you some questions and to have some input from you. But please feel free to just interrupt us at any point you want to, to have a reflection, to ask questions. And I'm looking here at the chat, people from the Vermont, Vancouver, Cambridge, Victoria. Okay, nobody from Brazil? As a Brazilian, I'm always search for some folks from the Global South. Not today. Okay, Sweden, nice. Okay, let me start sharing the screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this is our book, and the first question we already have to you, and you might just speak up, or if you want to write on the chat, also feel welcome. What is the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear the word research? Anyone would like to share?
Curiosity?
Curiosity. Yes. What else? research, academia, I see on the chat.
Slow.
Exploration, learning, to be interested. Exploration, co-constructing. Okay, empathy. I guess, you know, we are in a very easy group to talk to. You guys are already transforming the ideas on what research is and might be, controversy, cognition, listening. This is the reason why we asked this question at the very beginning is that we are in this book, we are not just offering a framework that might support you in your research endeavors, but also challenging the very idea of what is research, what is knowledge, how do we produce knowledge? And so challenging the dominant discourse of research being the place where the knowledge is created and opening space for the whole system and the variety of spaces and places that can offer knowledge and can contribute to the creation of academic knowledge. So how can we do that and still, you know, design rigorous research? So we challenge the whole epistemology of what it is to do research and how can we produce knowledge. And I guess all of you are already quite well informed with this approach. And so, as I was saying in the beginning, we are trying to combine the philosophy of social construction with the attributes and the principles of design thinking. And we bring a bit of, what are we talking about when we bring social construction as a theory, as a philosophy, as a cosmovision for research. And I would like to invite Sheila to say a little bit more about those centralities that we are calling in the book.
Yeah, so thanks, Tseliou. There are so many different ways, as I'm sure you're familiar, to explain or articulate social construction and what it is. But these are the central ones that we have picked out to focus on. And I'll start with language. Rather than focusing on cognition or isolated actions or so forth, the emphasis in social construction is on language, but what I prefer to refer to as language practices, in the sense that we're not just talking about words, we're talking about all embodied activity. And so that moves us to pay attention to the next issue that is central, which is process, the unfolding, never-ending process of interaction. So again, instead of isolated actions or isolated qualities or traits of people, we're looking at how action comes together, language comes together in not only between people, but between people and their environments. Also, the orientation is future-oriented. So it really is a moment of social construction. I mean, we can say with confidence that we don't know the future yet. So when we focus on the future, we are inviting people to enter into a moment of constructing possibilities. That doesn't mean we aren't interested in the past. Of course, you can have an interest in the past, but a lot of more traditional perspectives and theories, think that we need to focus on the past in order to understand the present and in order to move into the future. So this future orientation really helps keep us grounded in that notion that we are always engaged in constructing the world in which we live in. We see meaning as relational. I don't control meaning, you don't control meaning, but it's in the connection of our actions that meaning emerges. So for example, if I apologize to you for something that I've done, and your response is a non-acceptance of that as an apology, then I haven't managed to apologize. So meaning is we are dependent on each other to make meaning together. And we don't always have the same meanings, and that's okay. You know, we don't need to focus on that. But the notion that basically it takes two to tango, you know, that we need each other in order to create some sense of understanding. And then, of course, the last, which is important, is what is the context, and that different people will have different senses of what the same context is. They'll see it differently. Also, we know that as we move in and out of different relationships and contexts, that there's always that ever shifting notion. So we have to pay attention to those. So from a social constructionist perspective, these are the central issues that we bring in to then connect with design thinking centralities, which Tseliou, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, so if you take this this theoretical, philosophical, epistemological, we could even go into the ontological aspects of understanding the world and language and context, as social construction says. In my experience, also as an educator, sometimes you present those ideas and students and researchers, they might grasp it, but they are not sure, how can I do it then? You know, how can I do this idea that we are creating language, that we are creating systems and are being also created and shaped by the system? How do I create conditions for research that can be conducted and organized around these epistemological ideas? So design thinking is an approach that brings the possibility or offer many creative tools of bringing people together, of designing co-creation settings with participants that could be a way to, how can I say, it could be a way to activate in practicalities the ideas of social construction. So design thinking comes from the discipline of design. So originally design is more about creating stuff, and design thinking takes the whole methodology of design, but to create social processes. So how can you design for social processes that you can, here we have that are human-centered, but we like to say more, go towards life-centered. So how can you consider humans and non-humans, and also be context-oriented? So we might be working with what we call global approaches, globalization approaches. So you are aware of global concepts such as sustainability, equality, however, having a sensitivity to the local context. So how sustainability, how climate change, how poverty might be addressed in different contexts. So design thinking is quite sensitive in looking at the very locality and be useful to those who are involved. How can we also connect different disciplines? How can we become transdisciplinary in addressing those topics, and also attentive to diversity, inclusion, and embracing multiple perspectives? And when we are talking about embracing multiple perspectives, we are not just talking about you know, doing a review of literature and see different researches that have been published, but also perspectives from the community, perspectives from social media, all sorts of perspectives that might play a role in a research that we should take into account? What are the silent voices on a topic? Are we looking at it? So in design thinking, the tools and the spaces they open for participants are quite connected to the ideas of social construction. So in the framework we are offering at the book, we bring these 4 phases, which are possible phases that researchers could go through as they are designing their topics. Not necessarily you need to follow in a linear way. You could always start from different places. So if you are more advanced in research, you can always play around backwards. And if you are a beginner, going from step 1 to 4 might help you into design with having a guideline in designing your research. And we would like to guide you through these different phases briefly, just to give you a bit of a flavor of what each phase entails. Here's a brief chart sharing with you how we are combining, and here you see on the top the social construction phases. So for each phase, for each of the 4 phases, we have constructionist ideas on research. So how we are collaboratively co-creating research. How can we move from, you know, traditional researchers? We start already with a research question, and here, how can we first appreciate and understand the topic, for then frame and reframe generative research questions that is not just based on a gap, but also related to what the context is asking you, and then data generation and mini-making, forming futures. So also related to what Sheila says, that we are more interested in creating what if, instead of getting too stuck on what is or what was. So how can we create more promising futures? And the design thinking phases is about appreciating and connecting, defining and reframing, ideate and prototype, experiment and implementing. So we are trying to merge and combine both centralities to offer this framework. Important here, we said in the beginning how, as a researcher, we are an instrument. So we are continuously influencing and being influenced by your topic. So in that sense, you are a change agent. So the very question you ask in your research is already an invitation for directions we are going, and also the invitations for the interviews you are doing, and the approach you are taking to the process is already changing the system. So how in the book we talk about some of the approaches as a researcher that could support you in being a constructionist design thinker researcher, by being appreciative and empathic. Somebody said in the chat, being empathic, engaged. How can you explore different combinations? How can you connect ideas? Also about being dialogic, an agent of change, a co-creative catalyst, and then at the end, how can you collectively use your collective creativity to engage the collective to experiment and implement possibilities for your system. And before we enter into each phase of the framework, we would like to invite you to reflect a bit on how we are claiming that research is creative. So we see research as creativity, we see research as innovation, and also research is also an intervention. How does thinking about research in these terms might invite you to reflect on your own research habits? And I will just stop sharing a little bit, just to look at you and to see some responses. So how does thinking about research as creativity, research as intervention or innovation, might invite you to reflect on your own research habits, or might invite you different directions in possibilities for research?
One of the things that probably is very familiar for all of you, but that we try to emphasize is that traditionally there's been a split between research is about discovery, and then there's all this other stuff that's change work, like consultation and education and therapy. It's about creating change. And so we're not alone in this. I mean, there are many different people who write about research as this moment. It is about change, that the minute we ask a question, we're opening up a possibility for, a different kind of answer. It depends on what kind of question we ask. And so I guess the question that Tseliou was asking is, do you yourself feel trapped in your professional life with this identity of researcher, where you have to be, as someone put in the chat, academic about your research, making discoveries about something where there's a gap in knowledge, and so you're discovering how to fill that gap. So, do you feel comfortable embracing this idea that research really is about change? We are creating possibilities as we engage in research and opening different ways of making meaning. So, a lot of nods.
I think sometimes it can feel as a researcher that maybe you're expected to be separate from what you're researching, rather than recognizing that potentially you're in relationship with it, and how that potentially, I suppose, you're creating things. You're not just looking at something that's completely separate from you.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, that's the gold standard, is to keep that objectivity and that separation. And so everything we have to say here is about completely throwing that aside. And at the same time, I do want to mention that we're not making a statement that traditional research is bad or wrong. I mean, all research is useful. The question is, for whom is it useful, and in what way is it useful? And my own feeling is that the research tradition is hegemonic. It's just like, if you don't do that kind of traditional research, you maybe won't get tenure if you're a faculty member, or you won't be published. And so we're, really, I think our effort is to add our voices to this argument that is not the only vision of research, that there's so much more that counts as research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tseliou, should we go on to the phases?
Yeah, just to add here, so as Sheila said, we are not just denying other approaches to research, but what is problematic is to have just one single story about what research is and how knowledge is produced, and how the book we wrote could play a role in creating different language games on how can you create knowledge and also report, in research in a rigorous way from a different logic. So instead of writing third person as if things just happened, being able to write in first person and being able to reflect upon how you are influenced and influence the research. So how can you do that in an academic setting that can also be considered high quality research? So shall I share the slides again?
So in phase one, again, to reiterate what Tseliou said, that you know, this isn't a linear process, but you know, we have to start somewhere. So this is where we're starting. We are introducing and connecting the design thinking concepts of appreciating and connecting, which are also central ideas for social construction, but we're connecting those with the constructionist ideas of collaborative co-creation. So, Tseliou, do you want to go to the next slide? In the constructionist design research process, we begin with appreciating and connecting with the topic. So in phase one, as we initiate our research, you know, we need to understand our subject. So rather than coming in thinking like, I know exactly what I want to study, we need to understand the existing situation of the system with which we're working. This kind of research, I mean, it can take place in any context, but a really good example is if you're working with a community to help a community solve a problem or change some aspect of the way they work together. We come in as researchers needing to be open to the multiple perspectives that already exist in that community. So the insights that we collect at this point unfold in a process of collaborative co-creation with the participants, of course. And we're equipped with the practices of design thinking and social constructionist epistemology that allow us here to reach beyond just facts and figures and expand our understanding of what's going on here. What is, you know, it's a searching here at this moment, hopefully to get the multiple perspectives of all of the participants involved. Do you want to go to the next slide, Tseliou? So here is just an example of how we can start this process by embracing the topic and the people and all aspects of the system with which we're working. So first we say play around with the ideas. You know, describe the topic. What do you want to know? Why do you want to know that? What's relevant for you, for the people involved in the system? Who's involved? Are there stakeholders? So kind of just play around with these ideas. And then once you've played around with those ideas, and that could be just working it out on paper, you know, thinking about the answer to all of those questions, then you can start a lit review and, you know, what's connected to this, what's the focus of this context, how does it function, what's its purpose, you know, whatever supplemental information we can find out, of course we want to include. Then we can go into the field and do some initial interviews with participants, with people in the community. And this is the moment to connect with the system. You know, what does this context look like? How do things seem to work here? You know, we're sort of like the foreigner. We are the foreigner in this moment, just trying to figure it out. Who are the main actors? How do people feel about the main actors? Who are the relevant people who should be interviewed? Are there some that are obviously missing? So, you know, we're trying to answer all these questions. We find sort of putting this kind of a chart out, particularly for novice researchers, this is really helpful to run through this. And then to design some co-creation sessions, you know, who should participate. Making personal invitations always is much more generative than blanket invitations to people, because people feel you really want their input. So this is a much more relationally sensitive approach to research than that sort of large N study where, you know, you just are handing out surveys or whatnot. You can gather people. We think gathering people in smaller groups, because smaller groups, people feel freer to talk, but that's not the only way it can happen, but it's useful. Also, the environment is welcoming. It's something else that often isn't considered in traditional research. What kind of context are you inviting people into? Will they feel comfortable talking with one another? Of course, any of you who do focus groups probably understand the importance of those elements. And, you know, to prepare some initial questions, but of course, be comfortable with the fact that more questions will emerge. Then you map the system. How do you see things connecting? And do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah. So we propose this sort of rhizomatic map where you have all this information, all this, you know, data, you might call it, and you start putting it together and seeing how things connect. So that can be really useful, you know, because you're now seeing you've gathered multiple perspectives from different people who have some central interest in the system that you're examining and in the topic for that system that you're examining. And you have your own, you know, research, the field research, the literature review that you've engaged in. So how are you going to fit all this together? And that's kind of the fun part of creating this map. So that's the first phase.
Can I ask something here, Sheila?
Yeah, please.
Just to illustrate this combination of constructionism with design thinking. So in constructionist research, we want to bring to the surface the relationality and the intersections of the system that makes the reality happening. And the design thinking, they play a lot with visuals. So coming from a creative industry, they like visuals to help people to go beyond the rational and to have the visual to facilitate seeing the connections. So in research, mostly we stay just with words and the paper. And here we emphasize quite in many moments of the research, like how bringing the visuals might help you to elevate your findings and seek interconnections and also the priorities, because the bigger nodes are where the system connects and intersects the most, influencing what's happening. So this is also a good way to help you connecting all this info from literature review, from your own passion, from the participants, from the creative sessions, and then all come together in a more visual way.
Yeah. Okay, so the second phase, we integrate the design thinking notions of defining and reframing with the constructionist idea of creating a generative research question. Again, here that, you know, it's not, is my question right? I can't tell you how many PhD students, you know, ask that question. Is this the right question? Is this the right method? And so we try to avoid right and wrong or true and best. But how can we create together with the community a generative research question? So knowing more now about the topic from the phase one, getting the different perspectives and angles, now we know sort of what the situation is based on those conversations. And we want to bring that knowledge to the process of creating some generative research questions at this point. So here we explore combinations of already gathered information, framing and reframing. We all know that, you know, we're not seeking the right frame. So a frame is a way to connect ideas. It's sort of a container for a certain set of ideas. And then the question is, can we step back and take that same set of connections and create a different container? Can we reframe it in a different way? So if we, I think that maybe the next slide, Tseliou. I'm kind of running blind here with the slides. So, okay, yeah, so you can play around with that. So we zoom in and zoom out, you know, if you, before you zoom in, you just see a desert. Now, when you zoom in, you see this itsy bitsy little plant. Do you want to go to the next one? And, you know, looking left and looking right. So, you know, you look one way and you only see the branches. You look another way, you see the buds on the tree. So here, if we look at these dots, they could represent some information that we've gathered in the first phase, but if we can connect the dots in different ways. So we find these sorts of slides, these sorts of visuals useful, helping us to map and to change, reframe and reframe. So here's an example of taking the notion of food management, and we could have one frame that says we waste a lot of food, and how are we going to solve that problem of wasting food? But we also could take the same information and talk about food sharing. You know, how do we share our food? So it's a much more affirmative position, and it takes the same, you know, it takes the same data, but gives us something else to work with. So food waste is a problem orientation. Who's to blame? It's an individualistic paradigm. How can we fix it? Versus food sharing, you know, we're all in relation to this, and it's a relational paradigm. We're all involved, and let's explore how we can do more to share food. Okay, so the whole mindset has shifted. You want to go to the next one, and then you can see through this rhizomatic map, we can have the two different frames. We have the food waste and the food sharing, and can connect the pieces. So it's just a way of kind of bringing information into view in different ways, and then being able to make sense of what would be the best way to go forward and the most generative to create the most possibilities for the community you're working with. So you go to the next slide, I believe. Yeah, so here's another little, you know, useful tool for people who want to, you know, think about how they're mapping the situation. So the affirmations, you know, what statements can you make from the information that you already have? Then reflections, what other thoughts or different interpretations come to mind? What might you need to reflect on further? What are the kind of feelings that you have about what's going on here? You know, we all know that if you don't have a good feeling about going in a certain direction about your research, it probably is good to avoid that. And what doubts come to mind, what's still uncertain about the topic. And once you have answered all these questions and sort of thought about these framing and reframing processes, now you're ready to generate a research question. So do you want to go to the next one, Tseliou? Yeah. So here's some ways to move from a problem statement to a challenge. So you can ask, what's the issue? What's the challenge that's been presented here? And could it be reframed into identifying some different understanding of that issue? So I think that's central, is, you know, not to get into the groove of where people already are, but to try to think beyond, like, what are some other ideas? And what brings opportunity or possibility? What could emerge that's new from this different kind of understanding? And what would the benefits of doing this be? What might happen if you were to develop this research? So what might happen to the topic of food management, for example, to go back to that example, if you think about food sharing instead of food waste? So it's important to note that the research question that you develop here has implications, of course, for the methodology, the methodological choices that you make. You know, who should be your participants? Where should the research take place? What kind of methods will you use to generate data? And what kind of methods will you use to make meaning, to make sense of the data that you have? So, Tseliou, do you want to go on to the next phase?
Yeah, so I would like to just stop for a bit here and ask you again a question. Has anyone have an example of a collaborative co-research in your field that you have done or have read or have been engaged with? that might be not similar, but with the same idea of, as you see, we don't start with a research question and we don't set a priori what will be our methodology until we engage exhaustively in understanding the topic, and not just understanding from a scientific perspective, but also how I stand with this topic, how are the people involved understanding this topic, making this combination. And then the second phase is about playing around it with framing, reframing, crafting questions, and just then the research question will become your compass. And then this compass will tell you what are the best ways to gather your data and to move forward. So anyone has an example of a collaborative research project you have done? Empowering youth participation in governmental context. Interesting. Would you like to say more about that, Judith?
Yeah, can you tell us about it, Judith, just a little bit?
You said in the beginning that you were having some IT problems, and I see you are muted and I don't see your face. Maybe you're not. So if you can please share with us here, or her mic is not working.
Mic's not working, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, we have one sort of an example of having 9 PhD students come together. It was a collaborative setup for 1 year, and we worked with external stakeholders, and AMSI was one of them. But when we were trying to define what we as researchers collectively had in terms of our expertise and interest, and then to really try to work with the external stakeholder whom they had their own, needs and challenges. We call it a dance, but it is like the framing and reframing. And we went back and forth for many months, actually, which was a phase that was, I guess, from academic standpoint, it was somewhat frustrating in a sense, but it is, as Di said, research is slow in some ways, but that framing and reframing was a really critical phase now that we look back at it.
Yeah. And it's a phase that doesn't often happen for most people, because you latch on to a frame and okay, now I'm going to move forward with my research. So it's so critically important, and it is can take a long time, but it also can be fun. Like, who would think in our little example of food management, food waste is such a global issue, right? So who would ever, immediately think, well, let's explore how people share food and how you can share the food that doesn't look perfect, so it can't go to market, but it's still edible, and and meanwhile solving lots of related problems and issues, right? People who are poorly fed and so forth. So
yeah, as you said now, because this phase is crucial for the unfolding of the project. And from a constructionist standpoint, the questions you ask are already invitations for the directions that we're going to be moving. So, of course, validated questionnaires and protocols, they have their value, but you keep repeating the same questions and finding the same answers. But if you start crafting new questions, what else might you find out that you have never thought of or never heard? Because those are new questions and goes to different directions. And so.
Well, I might just jump in. What was striking about the example that Naoko was referring to? I was part of that project, and there is a certain, like, research usually is related to outcomes, but of course you're sort of in some ways disrupting that traditional notion of what research is, because in some ways the outcome really becomes tertiary or even further down the road, because it's really about that co-creation and that exploration and the collaboration. And then what comes out of that, like you're saying, the questions or what you find or the relationships develop, those are really the findings as opposed to the actual findings. And I'm thinking of, in our example, that was true because there was a real clear sense of what was intended by the external stakeholder, by the researchers. And then, of course, by the end is now, so there's this bit of a dance where, it was just more about how do we work together, less about what's the importance of getting to the findings. And then, new questions did emerge, new kind of relationships emerged. And I know we're talking in academia, and I guess one question I had a bit is, thinking about research even outside of academia, or even research from therapeutic standpoint, from, community-based research, which is, quite different than academic research in some ways. Yeah, or, even sort of, you can think of education in some ways as a form of research. And I guess one of the questions I had with that was, how do we practice this kind of research in some of those other modalities, in those kind of creating relationships? You might not have a research question in a therapy situation, but you're still in some ways co-creating meaning, and the research is being created, and you are in some ways tacitly creating these kinds of agreed upon questions, right, that you're working through. I mean, we could see that in teaching, we could see that in again, different kind of community aspects. And I know some of the folks here are probably in different areas than just academia. So I was trying to think, how do we sort of see these play out in similar ways? And I thought, both you have experience in these practices, so I thought that might be helpful a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Derek, because that's a really important point. And I think years ago, I wrote a book with a colleague, Diane Hosking, called Research and Social Change. And the point of the book, small book, but it was designed because we had been working with so many PhD students who were so eager to do these incredibly pragmatic research projects for their dissertation, like changing a community, working with gangs in an inner city and things like that. And they were so excited. And then it hit them when they entered into the PhD program, like, oh my God, I have to do research. And this idea of research was like way up here, and their ideas were like really practical. And there was a disconnect, and they started disbelieving in themselves. So we wrote this book that basically we tried to make the argument that, we are all engaged in research all the time, all of us. As we move through the world, we're engaged in processes of inquiry. And as your example of, the framing and reframing and creating relationships and making change, that's probably more important than the outcome of the research. But it depends on to whom. So for the funders of your research, the outcomes, the results are what's important. So we have to keep all of those in mind, but not keep only that in mind, that the results for the person funding my research or for whomever is the most important thing. And I think we need to recognize that as human beings, we are connecting with others and entering into their lives as we engage in research, and it's changing us as much as it's changing them. And so to have a much more I don't know, I guess I would say humble notion of what counts as research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just sharing a small experiment we are doing here at the university. We created a learning community with different students with different projects, but coming together to learn from each other and to create this learning community. And some of them are doing a graduation project, so they have to follow, the academic rules, and others are just having, regular projects within their courses. And we are following this constructionist design framework. And it's interesting to see how can we play the game and to understand, as Sheila says, we are all researchers. We are all the time producing knowledge and changing the system. However, the way you show the frame and the format, it depends on the context. So you need to play the game. So if you're doing a more academic way, what is the language that you need to write that your committee will recognize and accept? And for those who are not in those graduation projects, they can experiment more without worrying with those frames. So they play more about it. One of the students last week, she came up with this intuition methodology, where she's exploring this whole body response that she has. She can pay attention when in the moment she needs to make change, she needs to make decisions on how to facilitate and interact with participants. She checks how her body is feeling in that relationship, and she responds to that. This is beautiful. This is knowledge. However, if you would be doing a PhD research, probably would be harder to talk about the intuition methodology. You would have to play around and call something else or add something else. So it is to have this understanding that we are researchers, we are producing knowledge, but we also have to play around with the system depending on the context.
I want to add one more example. I have a colleague who is a psychiatrist and has a very innovative way of working with people who are deeply psychotic. And, who's his audience? Like, people like me, think his work is great and that's fine. But people like in the psychiatric profession, medical doctors, his way of working, which is all about gathering big communities together and having open dialogue, it doesn't resonate, okay, with that community, because they want data, they want statistics, they want numbers. So years ago, I remember him presenting, and there was such a disconnect between this presentation he was giving with these slides with all this data, these data points, and what I knew his work to be. But then I realized that actually he was very clever, because he needs both. He needs people like me who get the work that he's doing outside of the mainstream and support it. And he also needs the support of a community that wants data, hard data. And so he did that. And I think we all can do that. We can all give a questionnaire. It's not that questionnaires or certain research tools are bad. The question is, what do you do with that information? Do you treat it as truth and that's it? Or is it just another data point? Is it just more information that you can then join with other forms of information and get a more complex picture? So that's, I think that's the move afoot for all of us, is to not shun traditional research, particularly for those of us who are in contexts that value it. You're shooting yourself in the foot then, right? But to also be really clever in how you kind of shade that, that it's not the truth. It is very useful information that now you can combine with this other kind of information.
Yeah. And I guess that brings us to the next phase, which is the phase that we call data generation and data meaning making, which is completely related to what Sheila just said. We are not collecting data. We are not collecting something that is already there waiting to be discovered. But as we engage with data, we are generating information. We are generating understanding. We are creating new possibilities of seeing a topic, of engaging with the topic. And the data analysis, we are not being a very neutral researcher interpreting the raw data and revealing what is in there, but we are making meaning. As we engage with this data we are generating with the research participants. So in this phase, we want to move, we want to make very explicit that we are generating it, and also we are creating possible meanings. At the same time, we are being very reflective of ourselves, reflective and reflexive of how we are engaged with our topic, we are engaged with our research participants, we are always influenced and being influenced by the whole system. So being aware of that and being aware of our biases, it helps us, even ethically speaking, making decisions of choices, directions, and conversations we are having. So it has a very strong implication role for us as a researcher when we understand our data as this collective generation of data and meaning making. And at the book, we also offer some tools from design thinking to generate data and also to make meaning of data. And again, many resources that are tapping into the visuals, into storytelling, into metaphors, as a way to tap not just into the rationality, but also going beyond rational understanding. So when we ask rational questions, usually we have, we already have pretty much answers of topics we work with, we are engaged with. But when we are working with more metaphorical approaches and stories, we give the opportunity of, what if? We give the opportunity of imagining other possibilities. So also photo voice, working with photography. How can we empower your research participants to go out there and to take pictures of their context, of their topic, and then tell stories and have a different conversations on the topic. So if you are not collecting what is out there, the reality waiting to be discovered, but we are generating, how can we find other ways that expand our understanding and support us to go beyond the individuals, but really look at the systems that play a role in what we are researching. So here at this chapter, we also start talking about how can we describe academically the quality of our research. So from a constructionist perspective, we are approaching our understanding of knowledge from a different epistemological perspective. So we are talking more about, methodological coherence, generativity, the empathic neutrality, the thick description, also sharing the world view of the researcher. So anyone reading your research, they know where you're coming from. So we give elements to show the quality of the research that's not based on replicability or generalization. So there are other elements that can show the quality of research. And especially if you're doing an academic research, you also need to play this game and to show that what you are doing is also valid and rigorous. And from the design thinking part, in design thinking, they always transform or try to transform. They make an effort in translating knowledge into action. So we also invite in the book, how can you look at your data? How can you look at the sense you made of your data and your findings? How could you translate into a prototype? Meaning, how could you translate your ideas into one first action? What would be your call for action, a first intervention, a first transformation in which your knowledge might be useful beyond your academic endeavor? So how can you also be useful to the people you are working with? And then finally, the last phase is about forming futures. So experimenting and implementing. So when you have this prototype, when you have an idea of a possible action, how could you engage your system into experimenting and implementing this idea? So very different from sometimes you first create a very robust plan, and then you just top down go there and try to implement in a community, in an organization. Here is more about how one idea can be having an experimentation, and by checking and having this feedback of the experimentation, you can implement more and expand your ideas, forming new futures. So really creating new realities, creating change within your system. So you experiment with the opportunities, you try to check the utility and the practical purposes of your prototype, and prepare for implementation. So here's also about, as you experiment, you learn more about the system, about your context, so you can create more strategies to a successful implementation of your findings, of your ideas. So these are us, the authors and the illustrator of our book. And yeah, let's